Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. So if I sound a little bit congested, please forgive me. I think I'm coming down with a bit of a cold, but that's no excuse and no reason to not make some progress on the projects around here. So today we're going to be working on the parachute mount for the Mark IV. And I have the first piece of it right here. And this is the stub that goes into the backside of the chassis. Hopefully this isn't latched. There we go. And it goes through this back portion of the chassis and the parachute mount right here, through this hole in the back bumper in the rear of the unibody, and it fastens in with a couple of large high-grade fasteners. So this piece needs to sleeve into this piece, but before I do that, I need to take this length right here, figure out where the center point is, and drill a few holes in this piece of tubing for some rosette welds. So what a rosette weld is, you drill holes in the piece of tubing, you slide the internal sleeve portion in, and you do essentially a plug weld. So I'll weld those holes up, welding this outside piece to the inside piece, in addition to this, I guess it would be a lap weld right here where my thumb is, and this makes everything a little bit stronger. So in order to do this, I need to figure out what the circumference of this is, divide it by 4, as I'm going to do 4 rosette welds to make this really, really strong. And then I can sleeve that the inner piece into the outer piece, weld everything together, and then cut to length. The first section of the parachute mount is all welded, and I'm very happy with the end result. So you can see the lap weld right there came out nicely. All of the rosette welds came out nicely. And now I can go ahead and start working on this side of it. And I have something pretty special and what I think is pretty cool that goes on that side of it. So over here on my table, we have all of these parts. And this is a piece from Hammer Concepts and Designs. And this is a dual parachute tethered mount deal that also has provisioning for a push bar. So this will make a little bit more sense once everything is put together and everything is welded up. So why don't I go ahead and do that, and then once everything is together, we can talk more about it. After a bunch of welding and not so much fabrication, as most of that was done for me, but a lot of welding, we now have the first portion of the new parachute mount completed. So this is what I ended up with, and I am extraordinarily happy with this piece. So I guess we'll go from this side down to here. So this is the piece of 1.5" 120 wall 4130 chromoly that I turned down, and turned down, I have to put heavy quotation marks around that, as I did that with the belt sander. Not ideal, but I still don't have a lathe, so I made do. But I turned this down to fit inside of our 1 5/8" 83 thousandth wall chromoly tube, and got my holes drilled to bolt it to the chassis, to the cage. I have my 4 rosette welds put in place, so that way this side should stay together, although I may end up coming in and making a plug to weld on the back side, just in the off chance that the bolts fail or something like that. There's some sort of a catch on the back side to prevent this from shooting out the back of the car. So moving up, we don't have a whole lot in this section right this moment, but that will soon change. And we get down to this side right here. So I have to give my buddy Chris over at MazFab a huge shout out for directing me towards this actual parachute tether, and also a huge shout out to Hammer Concepts and Designs for conceptualizing and designing the best dual parachute tether that I've ever seen before. So they sell this as a kit, and it's a really nice piece, and it incorporates essentially all of the design elements that I could possibly think of into one piece. So on either side, we have the actual tethers for the parachutes. This is what the parachute will attach to. So when it deploys, this is what it's pulling against, or I guess these are what it's pulling against to help slow the car down. So they have all this cool gusseting, the top plates, or top and bottom plates. They have even some triangular gussets, or triangulation gussets with speed holes, mind you. And that just leaves this center section right here. So those of you that have been around drag cars may know what this is for. Those of you who have not, the purpose of this big center quick release pin is for a push bar. So oftentimes, if you have a car that is running on methanol, or that doesn't have a cooling system, doesn't have a charging system, so on and so forth, it's pretty common practice to hook the car up to a golf cart or a quad ATV, something along those lines, to push the car back to the pits. So although I don't suspect that I'll be using this feature, as the car has a full cooling system and charging system and all of that, if it breaks, it would be nice to have the ability to be able to push the car back without having to do it by hand. So that will end up coming in quite handy for that later. So when Hammer designed this thing, they have all their spacing set up appropriately, so a Heim joint will fit in between here, and all that you do is simply come in with your pin, drop it in place through the Heim, and then you can start using, I guess, at a golf cart or something along those lines, to push your car back to the pits. And most importantly, if I go through here, slide this in place, and I'll just put one bolt in for right this moment. Not quick release, but a removable parachute mount. And I positioned this right about there, and it sits back a little bit from the edge of the actual drag wing, and that gives me plenty of real estate where I can tie into it with all the structure that will actually house the parachutes themselves. Today, I get to begin building the actual wire structure that will house the parachutes and the launchers themselves. So I have one of the launchers out here on the table, and I measured out the dimensions of the mounting plate, or the base plate here, and it looks like it's an 8 3/4 inch square, which with my little chicken scratch long multiplication here gets us right at 35 inches. So materials wise, I went to Home Depot Racing and I got a bunch of these 3/8 pieces of rod slash bar slash whatever. So these are 3 feet long. I need 35 inches to make the square. So I should be able to make both of these squares out of a single bar for each of them. And then I can figure out how to tie them together and mount them and all of that. So hopefully this will be pretty straightforward. Hopefully I can do the math well enough and not screw anything up. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get to it. After a little bit of a fight, as projects like this always are, the parachute mount, at least the first section of it, is tacked and it's holding its own weight right now, although it does certainly need more supports, but at least we have the base of it completed, and now I can move on to the rest of it. So underneath here, we have 2 support bars coming off of the top of the main wire frame going down to the mount there, and I'll take some off the bottom sides over to the mount, so on and so forth. I'll essentially keep adding steel to this until it's sturdy enough and I feel good about it. So it's still cooling off right this minute, but once it cools off enough where I'm not burning my hands trying to get this out of here, I'll pull the whole assembly out and I can build the rest of this on the bench. Well, I got everything welded. I coiled the spring launchers up, and this is what we're looking at right now. So I did as intricate of a wire frame as I deemed necessary. I have 2 tie-ins up top and a whole bunch of them down low. So this thing should be nice and sturdy. And keep in mind that the wire frame, its only job is just to hold the parachutes in place, to hold them in these spots. All the force is going to be exerted on these tethers down here and the rest of the structure going up to the backside of the chassis right there. So the wire structure, while it may be a little bit overdone, I think it looks cool, and it's going to look awesome under a layer of powder coat. So with the hatch down, see if I can do this one-handed. There we go. With the hatch down, bear in mind it'll sink down about probably an 1/8 inch more. I put this whole mount right past the edge of the backside of the wicker on the wing, so that way when these deploy they're not grabbing the wing or anything like that. And they're also angled up a little bit, if you guys can see that right there. So that way when I do deploy them, they launch directly up into the airstream coming off the back of the car, which is kind of what you want to have happen to actually have a parachute do its job. So I'm very excited and very happy with this, and there's a couple little other odds and ends that I have to sit and think about if I want to implement them into the design or not, namely holders for the actual release cables, but I'll sleep on that as it's late here now, and with the itis that I have, I don't exactly feel the best, so I'm going to get out of here, relax, recuperate, and decide if that is something that I want to do. I ordered the parachute release setup, so the handle, the cables, all of that. And I'm in the process now of putting the actual parachutes on the back of the car, so that way I can kind of mock up where exactly the cables, the release cables, the rip cords are going to run. And I can also mock up for cable guides at the same time. So this one I have on here, obviously the primer pin is still in place. In this one, I unwound the spring so that way I can put the actual outside bag on it and then put the parachute in there. So with the spring launcher off of the car, I can begin fitting the bag to it. So the bag goes around the whole launcher setup, but I have my 4 mounting holes, which you can see hopefully from that perspective, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And we need holes in the bag so that way this will just get pinched between the mounting plate of the flange on the launcher and the actual parachute mount itself. So all I need to do is slide the bag over the spring launcher, pull it up so it's in its happy home, and from there I can kind of use my fingers and feel around where the holes are, and I'm just taking a drill bit. This one happens to be a 3/16, and I'm spinning it backwards so that way it isn't trying to grab this fabric and rip it around. And I'm just finding the hole and simply drilling holes in the bag. Now that I have the holes in my spring launcher bag here, the bag itself rather, I can go ahead and put my fasteners back in their homes and get this put back on the car. With all 4 of my fasteners in place, I can just put this back in its home. Alright, now that I have the bag on here, I need to retract the spring back in. I need to put the primer pin back in place, and then I can put the actual parachute itself back on this launcher. Now these spring launchers are a little bit of a pain to get put back in their homes, but certainly not an impossible feat. So I'll fold this bag out so that way none of it is going to get caught as I'm winding this up. And then using a ratchet and a 15/16 socket, I'm just winding everything back in. So the closer that I get to the bottom, the more difficult it is to turn, and sometimes I'm putting my knee on here just to hold it so I can cycle the ratchet. So there, now that I have the spring retracted, I can slide this pin back in place, get it in its home,
and then let pressure off of the ratchet, slide that out of the way. And this thing is now primed, and as soon as I would pull the pin out, provided that everything else is in place, it would be ready to launch with the pull of the ripcord. Now we need to put the parachute tether around the tether on the mount itself. So I'll go ahead and I'll loosen this bolt, and then I can pull this little aluminum piece out as well. It's a little bit of prying and persuasion to do so, no big deal. From there, the tether on the parachute goes around that aluminum piece, and this goes back in its home right here. So get your trusty hammer, tap this back in place, and go ahead and put this bolt back in its home. So again, you may need to use your hammer, and then I can just simply bolt this back down. And that is in its home. And the final step right now is getting the parachute in the bag. So I guess one pre-staging thing that needs to be done is this little loop on the parachute bag itself. Take a piece of string. These Stroud chutes come with this cord, and you simply lace this through here. We can slide that out of the way for right this moment, and then we can start putting the parachute in here. And I'm not sure if I'm putting it in here the correct way right now, but it doesn't really matter all that much for what I'm doing at this moment, as we're just doing this for mock-up. So I'll go ahead and put my parachute in here and start pulling the bag up around it, like so. And now is when this string is really handy, because you're going to use this string to lace it through, or you're going to lace the string rather through the different flaps on this parachute bag. One bit that you want to be cognizant of is you want the flap on the opposite side of where the ripcord will be. And I'm figuring the ripcords will run through the center over here and come up and grab the parachutes that way. So the opposite side would be this side over here. So I will lace these through this inner side, pull that up, and then we'll grab this outer flap last. And then just pull it into place. And I have just these little bolts for right this moment that will hold everything in place. And then I can pull my string out, and the parachutes are sitting happily in their homes. I did some research to figure out what the average or standardized size for the sheath on a parachute cable is, and went down to my beloved Home Depot Racing and got these guys that will be used for the parachute cable guides. So these little steel spacers, I've used them a few times on different projects, and they work out really well. And all that I'm going to do is weld these together, and then they will sit probably somewhere on this lower bar right here, just to give the cables a bit of a guided path up to each one of the parachutes. And when the parachutes are actually deployed, and the actual ripcords pull out of the parachutes, they're not flopping around all crazy on the back of the car. Those will work to kind of retain them in a centralized location and make me a lot happier. Everything is now reassembled in the back of this parachute mount. So I took the parachutes loose just so that way as I was welding in the little cable guide here, I didn't end up burning up either of the bags, as it was going to get a little bit toasty as I was welding all that stuff together. But that is squared away now, and I'm really at a stopping point with this for the time being until the cable, or I guess the whole release system, and a couple other bits of material arrive to knock out the final stages of this parachute mount build. So I guess with that in mind, we're about at the end of this episode. So I had a lot of fun building this, and it was something that, again, another thing that's really outside of my wheelhouse, is I don't do a whole lot of wire bending and frame building and stuff like that, but I'm pretty happy with how this came out, and it certainly is not perfect, but it will be more than good enough to get the job done for this thing. I guess this is a good example of what you can do with some simple materials. So there's nothing really fancy that went into this, just some chromoly and then a bunch of mild steel bar from Home Depot. And I make the joke a lot about Home Depot racing, but this is a testament to what you can do with some basic materials that anybody can get. So some basic materials, some simple tools, and you can build stuff like this as well. So before I ramble on incessantly, let's go ahead and wrap this one up. So thank you guys, as always, for coming along on this journey with me, on all the journeys around the shop here, all the different projects, both mine and customers and everything else alike. I hope that you guys are learning things and having a blast coming along with me, because I know I am doing both of those things every single time that I hit the record button. So from the bottom of my heart, I thank you guys very much for being a wonderful viewing audience and for inspiring me to keep going and keep building this thing. So although we were not able to complete the parachute mount 100% in this episode, we'll get it knocked out in the next one, and then all that will be squared away. We can move on to the next step of this project. But that will be for then, because right now we're done with this one. So as always, be sure to subscribe, leave a like, leave a comment, check out the website for manifolds, for merch, for all things good that way, and I will see you all in the next episode.